All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon, and in this video, we are going to talk about Roy Jones Jr. and an admission that he made relative to the Errol Spence Jr. Terrence Crawford fight. Very subtle, but I think very interesting at the same time. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon, and in this video, we're going to be in the 147-pound division talking about something that Roy Jones Jr., Hall of Fame fighter, one of the best fighters I've ever seen in my life, had to say when recently asked about his prediction for the Errol Spence Jr. Terrence Crawford fight, if it happens. And there are more rumors out there that they're going to announce a date coming up pretty soon. So relevant conversation. But before I get into that, let me welcome you back to the channel. If you are new to the channel, thank you so much for your support. Please hit the subscribe button, hit the bell icon so you can be notified of when we release more videos. If you are a longtime subscriber or supporter to the channel, thank you so much for your support. It is greatly, greatly appreciated. There is a new way to support the channel. It is down in a little heart that's below called Super Thanks. Definitely goes towards supporting the channel so we can create more content. If you can support, great. If you can't, understand that as well. Hit that like button though on your way out the door. So let's go through this. All right. So a few months ago, in a very well publicized statement by Roy Jones Jr., he was asked to make predictions for the Errol Spence Jr. Terrence Crawford fight. And in doing so, he said that he believed that Errol Spence Jr., that Terrence Crawford, he favored Terrence Crawford for the fight, and then he said how the fight should play out and a way where, Errol Spence Jr. could cause Terrence Crawford some real problems. When I heard it, I thought to myself, wow, that to me really sounds kind of backwards. And what it was that he said, and he's also reiterated this within the last week, but made a clarifying statement, but he made it much more clearly this time, where I was like, okay, that makes sense to me. Now, what he originally said was that he followed suit with was that Errol Spence Jr., that Terrence Crawford should be able to do something with Errol Spence. Terrence Crawford should be able to do something with Errol Spence Jr. in like the first 6 rounds, right? He said that Errol Spence Jr. was a slow starter but he's a good pressure fighter. So as the rounds go on, he in the second half of the fight could be trouble for Terrence Crawford, right? So when I heard him say that, I thought to myself, man, that's not quite accurate about Errol Spence Jr. And I don't really get why Roy Jones Jr. would say that. The specific part that I'm saying is really kind of inaccurate with him is that Errol Spence Jr. starts off slow. Nah, that's not what I've seen from him. He pretty much is on go from about the first half, maybe the second round at the latest, but he is not calculating. He's calculating, but he is not taking his time trying to figure out his way in. Errol Spence Jr. pretty much puts the pressure on from the very beginning of the fight. And then as the fight goes on, that pressure picks up. But he's somebody that, really, and I don't know if I've ever seen him not dominate the first half of the fight or win a bunch of rounds, like win the majority of the first 6 rounds. The only time maybe that I could say that I saw that was in the Sean Porter fight, where it was more evenly distributed. But Terrence Crawford, on the other hand, if you've watched Terrence Crawford since he's been to welterweight, Terrence Crawford is the one that is really kind of in the first 6 rounds of fights looking like, he's basically fighting an even fight for the first 6 rounds or so. And then, if it gets past the 6th round, he seems to be like, find a spot and start picking up the pace after that. So it was almost like Roy Jones Jr. described it backwards, right? Now, Roy Jones Jr. obviously, is an expert at boxing, been a commentator for a long time, and he knows what he's talking about. But in the conversation this time, when he says it, he kind of was very clear. He's like, look, I saw a lot of Terrence Crawford I saw a lot of Terrence Crawford when I was on HBO, commentating on HBO. And then he clearly says, I have not seen as much of Errol Spence Jr. Right. So he's saying that number one, he's saying that he watched Terrence Crawford when Terrence Crawford was at HBO, and that he has not really watched much of Errol Spence Jr. Right now, if you listen to a lot of professional boxers and retired boxers, a lot of these guys don't sit down and watch all these fights. Right. They may see a highlight here, highlights there, but they don't sit down and watch it unless you're in a scenario like Raul Marquez was with Errol Spence Jr., who actually is the one calling the fight, for the Spanish broadcast of the show of Showtime, or Paulie Malignaggi, like when Paulie Malignaggi said, like when he was talking to Roy Jones Jr. in Tarver, he's like, look, you guys got Errol Spence Jr. wrong. Errol Spence Jr. is not your typical, pressure fighter that is coming in and is really getting hit on the way in. He's really working behind a jab and is pretty much boxing his way into the inside, not leaning over, head over the front foot, taking two to get one type of situation. So when Roy says that, he hasn't pretty much makes an admission that he hasn't seen Errol Spence Jr. that much, that made it make sense to me why he would see pretty much the opposite of what I've seen, which is, again, Errol Spence Jr. coming on pretty much from the beginning of the fight and Terrence Crawford picking up in the second half of the fight. So even with the Terrence Crawford aspect of that, earlier in Terrence Crawford's career, Terrence Crawford did go at it when he was on HBO. He did kind of go at it a little bit earlier in the fight and was more aggressive in the fight. But as he's aged and as he's, refined his craft, he's more looking for shots and setting up shots. And those have typically, like with Jeff Horn, with Jose Benavidez, Jeff Horn, Jose Benavidez, Sean Porter, those fights, and even Igis Kalvinakis, who he started off slow with. I don't know if it went to the 6th round with Igis Kalvinakis, but it took him a longer time to warm up and get into the fight and kind of find what he wanted to do to the guy. But it makes sense, from Roy to say that, because Roy, watched Terrence Crawford when he was at HBO, not necessarily when he's at ESPN, and he didn't ever really sit ringside and really watch and analyze Errol Spence Jr. unless he's doing it on his television set at home, which honestly, man, I'm telling you, those guys typically, will tell you that they do not do. Derek James is one of the things that he said. He's like, look, when I'm not training my fighter or working on my fighter, I don't watch that much boxing. I'm not watching all these guys fight. Roy Jones Jr. is probably very much the same way. But anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.